Chapter Chapter 6 is entitled Fading Away, which gives us an idea about what's gonna fade away. Something is going to vanish. We already know that Stephen is supposed to leave his work, so he might be fading away, moving to other different place. All these ideas are discussed in the chapter I recorded yesterday, but I missed to highlight one important point at the very end of the chapter. As the chapter highlights major points concerned with Stephen meeting Rachel and Mrs. Pegler. When he left Bounderby's house, he encountered Rachel and Pegler, that old woman. He declared his plans to leave the town to look for a job because he has been dismissed, but maybe in 2 or 3 days after he finishes what he's doing. Later we encounter Louisa and Tom visiting Stephen at his own house, and the writer makes it clear that this is the first time Louisa enters a house of the hands, a house of the workers. يعني the writer يحاول يشوفنا إنه الgap between this social class and the working class is very huge. يعني حتى ما يعرفون ذول الناس وين ساكنين، طبيعة بيوتهم، ما داخلين للبيوت مالتهم. So there is a kind of a huge gap between these social classes. That Louisa, it is the first time for her to enter such a house of a worker. So she tried to help Stephen, because Stephen kept looking at her in his interview with Bounderby, and she tried to give him some money, but of course he refused. We had an idea about a plan that Tom is staging. He asked Stephen to move around the bank after he finishes his night shift for 1 hour or 2 at night for something, and he promised Stephen that he will help him in return of this move. Yani he convinced Stephen that this kind of move that he's gonna make is going to be helpful, and he will talk to Louisa to talk to Bounderby in order to change his mind about Stephen. At the end of the chapter, you'll find Dickens interfering in the events, and this is the main point I wanted to highlight before going to the next chapter. Here is a kind of a threat. I call it a threat by Dickens. Dickens, as you know, he sometimes speaks on the tongue of Stephen, on the tongue of other characters, but here he speaks in the first person, and his speech is directed to those people who are dehumanizing the working class. Because of the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution, because of the bad conditions those people live, so Dickens tries to make a balance. He tries to attract attention in order to amend the conditions of those workers. So he says, utilitarian economists. Utilitarianism is one of the main concepts we talked about in the first lecture at the very beginning. We said it's a kind of definition. وقلنا الفلسفة النفعية إنه people care about their own interest, forgetting about the others, whether they eat, they don't eat, they get money, they don't care. And this is embodied in certain characters. We had an example اللي هو Bitzer, as we discussed in previous chapters, and we will have another example in the next chapter as well. Utilitarian economists, skeletons of schoolmasters, commissioners of facts, دول representatives of the fact system, genteel and used up infidels, gabblers of many little dogs, eared creeds, the poor you will have always with you. Here هذول الناس اللي the writer is talking about. So he says the poor اللي هم ستيفن وجماعته you will have always with you. لازم راح يكونون معكم، يعني ما راح تتخلصون منهم بسهولة. Cultivate in them. So he tries to show them that there is no kind of solution that could make them apart from this poor class. So he instructs them دول الناس cultivate in them يعني استغلوهم حاولوا تشجعوهم حاولوا make them just like a kind of land that could benefit you, and in return you benefit them while there is yet time. ما دام أكو وقت الآن, the utmost graces of the fancies and affections to adorn their lives. So try to soften their own lives because they need some kind of romantic element in their life. It's not only work from sunrise to sunset. Or in the day of your triumph, when romance is utterly driven out of their souls, أو عندما يأتي يوم وما يظل هذول الأشخاص a kind of motive that encourages them to live, and they and a bare existence stand face to face, وما يبقى لهم بس يعني الوجودهم بس حياتهم, يعني ماكو فد شي بعد they could combat for or battle for. They don't have anything else that keeps them going and living. At this particular point, reality will take a wolfish turn. راح تاخذ الحقيقة منحنى قاسي جدا صعب ووفش and make an end of you. يعني راح ينقلبون عليكم في اليوم و يعني you will lose the battle definitely at the end. So this is a kind of advice and a threat at the same time. يعني this is this is Dickens, Charles Dickens, talking about the kind of life that should be regulated between the capitalists, the utilitarian economists, the schoolmasters, the people of the facts, commissioners of facts, and the other side is the poor, the slice of the society represented by Stephen. So unless we have a kind of balance in life, unless we provide them with some kinds of joy, of ornaments, fancies, affections, as the writer calls them, then reality one day will turn over and those poor will make an end of those people. So this is a kind of solution that Dickens provides for the economists and the capitalists. And this is the end of the chapter. This is the main point that I wanted to highlight because I missed to discuss that in my previous video. So here we can move to the next chapter. You might have enough time to have a look at this chapter after we finish. Now the previous chapter was entitled Fading Away, and the current chapter is entitled Gunpowder. So I think now we can start, let's say, a new series, يعني حلقة جديدة من النوvel. The previous chapter was concluded with Stephen, the working class, the effect of the Industrial Revolution, Bounderby, the mills. All these ideas were included in Fading Away. But now we move to a little bit something different. يعني Dickens عادة ياخذ 2-3 chapters where he can highlight something and then he shifts to another different topic. مثل ما شفنا في Fading Away وMen and Masters اللي قبله وMen and Brothers اللي قبله. We're highly concentrating and focused on Stephen and the workers and the Industrial Revolution. So in this chapter, so this chapter is moving to something new, some different topic. From the title of the chapter, we understand that gunpowder refers to something. Gunpowder يعني البارود. اللي الوقود مال الاشتعال مال الbullets مال الميسيلز مال الrockets, anything related to that could lead to something big when it explodes. So this is the let's say the link, or this is a kind of a line where at the end of the line there is something big to happen. So this chapter is entitled Gunpowder, and the next chapter is entitled Explosion. So this gunpowder is going to explode in the next chapter. I'm talking about this in order to give you an idea about the significance of the titles that Dickens employs in his novels. The chapter, generally speaking, gives us an idea about James Harthouse. Now we are moving to, as I said, a different setting. James is visiting Bounderby at his own house, and he is meeting Louisa, and later he is meeting Tom, and some new development is about to happen in in their relationship. The beginning of the chapter stages the meeting, prepares the events for a kind of development that is ongoing between Mrs. Bounderby, Louisa, and James Harthouse. We already described James Harthouse as the devil. The writer described him as the tempter, الغاوي, اللي هو الشيطان, the devil. And we understand that James tries to develop a kind of relation between him and Louisa, because he was so influenced by the way she looks, the way she behaves. He heard a lot about her, so he is interested in developing his relation with Louisa. He did not have a way to develop this, and managed to find that a kind of a clue that he grasped in previous chapters concerned with Tom. When Tom entered the house, Louisa was smiling, so he knew that Tom would be the key to the relationship between him and Louisa. So now that's why he described Tom as the whelp, the dog. So now he tries to use Tom as a kind of a bridge by which he could strengthen his relationship with her. We can skip these introductions and highlight the points I put in yellow. Mr. James Harthouse began to think it would be a new sensation if the face would change so beautifully, for the whelp would change for him. He was quick enough to observe. He had a good memory and did not forget a word of the brothers' revelations. The revelations that Tom made at the hotel when he started talking about Louisa. She doesn't like Bounderby. She would not have married Bounderby if it was not for Tom's sake, and this kind of discussion, I think you remember. So he interwove them with everything he saw of this sister, and he began to understand her. To be sure, the better and the profounder part of her character was not within his scope of perception. I'd like you to focus, because I will ask you about this issue about Louisa and James.
Excuse me, Doctor.
Yes.
There is no sharing for the screen.
There is no sharing for the screen?
No.
Okay, you should have reminded me earlier. Okay, I started here. I talked about the gunpowder, and I said we can ignore the beginning and focus on what is highlighted here. So James began to think it would be a new sensation if the face which changed so beautifully to the whelp would change for him. He was quick enough to observe. He had a good memory, and I said this has been revealed in the hotel meeting between Tom and James. We can skip. We have so many discussions here concerning James and so many details which we do not need to go through. You can read if you like at home, but I can only point out the main things, the main ideas that we need in the chapter here. It was among the leafy shadows of this retirement in the long sultry summer days. This is a test setting of the story, summer days. Hothouse began to prove the face which had set him wondering when he first saw it. So this is one of the reasons why Hothouse wants to develop a relation with Louisa, because he is captivated by Louisa. If it would change for him, if he will be able to make Louisa smile for him the way she smiled to her brother. And here we have discussions between Louisa and James. Mrs. Bounderby, I esteem it a most fortunate accident that I find you alone here. Of course he did not find her, he was looking for her, and he managed to see her in an orchard, بستان قريب على بيت Bounderby, and he tries to discuss and talk with her. He sat down beside her with a glance at her face. And he started with the first sentence, your brother, my young friend Tom. See how this kind of character tries to leak into her heart, into herself, by using Tom as a bridge. Her color brightened and she turned to him with a look of interest. I never in my life, he thought, saw anything so remarkable and so captivating as the lighting of those features. This is what he says. His face betrayed his thoughts, perhaps without betraying him, for it might have been according to its instructions to do so. Pardon me? Yani we can skip this part when we talk. My brother, my young friend Tom. And then she asked, pardon me, the expressions of your sisterly interest is so beautiful. Tom should be so proud of it. I know this is inexcusable, but I am so compelled to admire. So here he is just like making his speech flavored with certain sentences and words that could capture Louisa's attention. I am waiting for your further reference to my brother. You are rigid with me, and I deserve it. I am so worthless. He is talking about himself as a dog, as you will find, except that I am not false. Talking about himself. This is Stephen. This is James. I am rigid, yani barid, jamid. I am worthless, but I am not false, as if he is convincing her that his feelings are true feelings. But you surprised and distorted me from my subject. Have you an interest in anything? Said Harthouse. Mr. Harthouse, Louisa asked. If you had asked me when I first came, يعني هاي discussion, it is not very important. We only need the important details that develop the major themes. I give you a credit for being interested in my brother. One step closer to Louisa now, James. I am interested in him for his own sake. Yani he cares about him for his own sake. Allow me to be frank. Do you think he games at all? يعني gambling, يلعب قمار. I think he makes bets, and he loses, of course. Supplying him with money sometimes. You supply him with money for these purposes. Yani Louisa gives him money. Of course, we know that he gets money from Louisa. Acquit me of impertinent curiosity, my dear Mrs. Bounderby. I think Tom may be gradually falling into trouble, and I wish to stretch out a helping hand to him from the depths of my wicked experience. So James tries to show that he cares a lot about Tom, and he is so much interested in helping him, in raising him from where he is going. So he tries to prove that to Louisa. Mrs. Bounderby, he said, may there be a better confidence between yourself and me. Tom has borrowed a considerable sum of you. Of course, we know that he takes money from Louisa. When I married, so spirited too, thought James. When I married, I found that my brother was even at that time heavily in debt. This is Louisa. Heavily, for him I mean, heavily enough to oblige me to sell some trinkets. They were no sacrifice. I sold them very willingly. I attached no value to them. They were quite worthless to me. So this is a kind of relation between Louisa and Tom is highlighted here. She loves him. She even sold her own gold, her own jewelries, trinkets, and she does not attach any value to that in order to absolve Tom from his own debts. I cannot possibly be hard upon your brother, I understand, and shared the wife's consideration. But he did not receive the good training, التريننج اللي حصل عليه من السكول of Fats. All allowance, he continued, must be made. I have one great fault to find with Tom, however, I cannot forgive, and for which I take him heavily to account. I cannot forgive him for not being more sensible in every word, look, act of life, affection of his best friend, of the devotion of his best friend, of her sacrifice. Yani he does not pay attention to what Louisa is presenting and helping. James is trying to be just like a kind of a man of advice, a man of wisdom, a kind of a judge, and he tries to present advice and help to Tom. He assisted her to rise and she took his arm, James and Louisa, and they advanced to meet the Tom, because he entered the scene now. You can have a look at this, and you see, Tom, you are inconsiderate. You expect too much of your sister. You have had money of her, you dog. You know you have. James talking with Tom in front of Louisa. Well, Mr. Hothouse, I know I have. How else was I to get it? شلون لعد أخذ المونey? Here's old Bounderby, always boasting that at my age he lived upon 2p a month. Here is my father drawing what he calls a line and tying me down to it from a baby neck and heels. Here is my mother, who never has anything of her own except her complaints. What is a fellow to do for money? And where am I to look for it, if not to my sister? منين أجيب الماني؟ إذا باوندربي يحكي أنه عاش ب 2p بالشهر, and his father was tying him and his mother was only complaining. So منين يجيب الماني unless from his sister? You know she didn't, Tom, you know she didn't marry old Bounderby for her own sake or for his sake, but for my sake. Then why doesn't she get what I want out of him for my sake? I'd like to ask you, what kind of principle is present in these 3 lines? We had so many themes at the beginning, discussed at the beginning of the novel. What kind of theme that applies here?
Selfish.
Another one? A basic important theme.
Utilitarian?
Yes, utilitarianism. الفلسفة النفعية is أو fits here because he cares about himself, and he doesn't care and he doesn't care about his sister. My dear Tom, let me try to be your banker, for God's sake, replied Tom sadly. Don't talk about bankers. A true friend. Whelp, whelp, thought Harthouse lazily. What an ass you are. And I take your offer as a great kindness, said Tom, grasping his hand as a great kindness, Mr. Harthouse. As we see now, Harthouse is developing his relation with Tom in front of Louisa. Louisa is witnessing this kind of development when he holds Tom, when he puts his hand on his shoulder, on Tom's shoulder, and this also leads to the development of the relation between James and Louisa. I know you are fond of me. I didn't mean to be Crossloop, he said, giving her his hand and kissing her. I know you are fond of me, and you know I am fond of you. After this, there was a smile upon Louisa's face that day for someone else, and that was James. هذا واحد من التارجتس, الobjectives that James wanted to achieve. So these are the basic points of the chapter. The title, Gunpowder, which leads to an explosion. So now we are preparing. A plan is set and an explosion is going to happen later. طبعا هذا explosion could be interpreted on different levels. It could be on Louisa level, it could be on Tom, or on Stephen level. James and Louisa, their relationship is developing, moving forward, and Tom is the bridge on which James is crossing. Tom is a utilitarian person, using his sister for his own purposes, and James, the purposes that James wants to achieve also. James wants to develop this relationship. My question is, why do you think the writer Dickens is staging this relationship between James and Louisa? It might be early for this question to come, but I want you to think about this question.